Hi, I'm Paul. Thanks for checking out this Power Apps video. So Power Apps has been with us for a few years now, and so there are an increasing number of apps out there in the wild being used by businesses and providing value to those businesses. And increasingly, those apps are going to need to be supported. And as time goes on, the people who originally developed those apps are less likely to be available to carry out any fixes or updates to them. And so I thought it was timely to do a couple of videos on how you can make your Power Apps more robust and how you can make them more easily maintainable. So this is a topic close to my heart at the moment because I have inherited a number of apps that have been developed by other people that I now need to try to support and unpick and work my way through. So if I get a little bit passionate from time to time, then you will understand why. So this first session is going to be on how you can make your apps more robust, and as I say, I will do a follow-up session on how you can make your apps more maintainable and make it less likely that the person who has to pick up your work later is going to be getting hold of a voodoo doll and sticking needles in it. A voodoo doll of you. Yes, so let's dive in. Okay, protect your data. So what I want to say here is that most apps exist to service the data. And it's the data which is really the important thing and the data that we should be protecting. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. So there are some apps where sort of the process is important, and once the process is complete, then that's it, you can forget about the data. So for example, I've worked on a few apps where the end user will put in some information and then the app will go away and build a SharePoint site or a SharePoint page based on that information. So that's information, data that once you've used it, probably not going to be useful again. Another example might be a reception desk type app. So someone comes in and there is a tablet or a PC at the reception of the building, and people put in their details and they put in the details of the person they're visiting, and then the person they're visiting gets an email or a text to tell them they have a visitor waiting in reception, and then at the end of the day when the visitor leaves they're going to sign out. And so you could say once that process is complete, once the visitor has signed out, well, that data doesn't matter anymore. But things have a habit of changing. So a year or so ago it probably didn't matter whether you could check who was in the building on a particular day. Now, with COVID and contact tracing, well, suddenly that becomes quite important. So if you've built your app and your database in such a way that the information isn't reliable, well, that starts to get serious, potentially. So I think you should always set out with the idea in mind that your data is important. So if your app can't save or read data, then that's bad. But if your app only saves partial data or the wrong data, or only displays wrong data or partial data, then that can be even worse. Once the opportunity to enter the data has gone, you might not be able to get the data again. So imagine your app is supporting a call center, okay? And once the call is finished, you're not going to be able to get the information about that call again. It's gone. And so if you're only saving partial data, that's a problem. And the other big problem with only saving partial data or incorrect data is you may not realize for quite some time that the data is wrong. And then you have no opportunity to go back and put it right. And equally, if you're basing decisions on incorrect data, then it might be too late to go back and reverse and change that decision once you realize that the data you were basing that decision on is incorrect. So the data is really important. And I'm going to argue that you should protect your data at the database level. So here we've got a database and we've got an app. And there are two places where you could do your verification, where you could try to make sure that no bad data is getting in. So if you put your verification on your database, then that's good because any bad data is going to sort of bounce off the app and it's not going to get into the database. But then the person using the app is potentially going to start getting nasty red error messages appearing because the app thought it was going to be able to save the data, but it couldn't, because the database says no, that violates some business rule. You can't do that. And so people have a tendency to say, well, if I've got to build some validation into the app anyway, so that I don't get these bad error messages appearing, then why don't I just build it into the app? If I've got to build it into the app, then I'll just build it into the app and not worry about the database. Well, you could do that, but then what happens when you've got more apps? Oops. There we are. What happens when you've got more apps that are accessing your database? If the developers of those apps have not been as diligent as you have, and they're allowing bad data to get into the database, then that bad data is going to be feeding back out to your app again. So you must protect your data at the database level. That's kind of crucial, and I think this is a message which is, not just relevant to Power Apps, but all kinds of development. So as I go through this talk, some stuff will be hopefully useful generally to people, and other stuff will be very Power App specific. Will be very Power App specific, excuse me. Okay, so how are we going to go about protecting our data? Well, the first thing we should do is we should model our data. We should normalize our data. So normalization is a process by which you separate out the different pieces of data in your database and make sure that each piece of data only appears once. So, for example, I only have one date of birth, but if that is recorded in multiple different places within the database, then sooner or later, and probably sooner, you're going to get inconsistent data. So someone is going to say, oh yeah, we recorded Paul's date of birth wrong, so we're going to change it, and they change it in one place and they don't change it in the other places. And then depending on where you look in the database, you're getting different information coming out of it. Bad enough with, say, date of birth, but that doesn't change very often. But let's say current address, yeah? So there are things that change potentially from time to time, and you want to make sure that you record all that information only once. So that's normalization. And normalization leads to what we jokingly call the database designer or database developer's oath. So there we go. Each attribute shall depend upon the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key, so help me cod. Now, if you don't understand that little joke, then you probably don't understand normalization, and if you don't understand data modeling to at least third normal form, then please stop. Move away from the database tools, stop building databases, and go and read up on normalization and understanding normalization. It's absolutely critical that you understand that. It's not rocket science, but equally it's not something that you just naturally, intuitively know. Okay, it's something that you have to learn the fundamentals of. Okay, if your data is not properly modeled, then you are inviting bad data into your system. And mistakes that you make now, you could be suffering the consequences of those mistakes for a long, long time to come. So while your Power App might have an expected lifespan of just a couple of years, your data might go on for decades. So if you mess up recording your data now, you can be storing up problems for a long time in the future. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny, as a wise man once said. So you must normalize your data, otherwise you are going to end up in problems. Now, this is where I'm going to say something which is going to be unpopular, which is that the different data sources available for Power Apps have different capabilities in terms of supporting normalization. To support normalization, normalization is splitting your data up into lots of different tables with lots of relationships and so on between them. And you then need a way of getting that information efficiently out of the database again, without the app having to do all the work. And unfortunately, certain data sources, so particularly SharePoint, do not support a query language that allows you to pull things from multiple tables. Dataverse has a very limited one. I have real issues with Dataverse. I've made videos about that. I don't believe you can call Dataverse a relational database management system. It fails on the relational part because it should have a way of pulling back data from multiple tables, more than one join deep. But I've done a separate video on that, so if you want to see that, take a look. But just keep in mind, depending on your data source, you may have to make compromises on your data model, and every compromise you make on your data model is opening up more scope for your app to fail. Every compromise is a decrease in robustness. Okay, enforce referential integrity. So once you have modeled your data, make sure that you actually use the tools available in whatever system you're using. This screenshots from SQL Server. Make sure that you switch on the referential integrity so that if you're referencing something in one place, you can't accidentally delete the parent record and cause problems. So you can lock things so that doesn't happen, and you can turn on cascade updates and cascade deletes and so on. So just make sure that you do use the referential integrity properly between your primary keys and your foreign keys. When you understand more about data modeling, if you don't already, then that will make a lot more sense. Okay, right, just move my little video clip around. Avoid nulls if you value your data. So a null is an unknown value, and often I see in systems the sort of thing that we've got on the right here, where the only required field, the only thing you actually have to complete for this table is the ID, which completes automatically anyway because that's the identity column. That's really bad, okay? So you must think about what is the minimum data that you need in a record for that record to make any kind of sense. Okay, and you must make sure that you turn off the nulls, or in Dataverse it's called an optional field. So make sure that you have a good number of required fields in your table. Think it through. Okay, a table with a record with no data is useless. Okay. Oh, got a little screen capture from Monty Python there. So there we are. There's Brian saying, hey, look, you're all individuals. And all the people are shouting back, yes, we're all individuals. You're all unique. Yes, we're all unique. Okay, define what makes your records unique. Okay, there should be something in the vast majority of cases that makes your record unique. Okay, and then make sure that you've actually enforced that in the database. And here's a clue. It should not be a surrogate key. So a surrogate key is just an incrementing number, or in the case of Dataverse, they use globally unique identifiers for some reason. It shouldn't be that, okay? I mean, you can have your surrogate key. Surrogate keys are fine, in my opinion. Some people will argue against it, but, you know, that's how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's a bit of a moot point. But if you have a surrogate key, don't make that the only thing that makes your records unique. If you've got a halfway decent database system, you should be able to set another column or another group of columns that say this record is unique. So, for example, I've been working on a system for handling fleet management, company cars, and so a good thing there for a key on the vehicles table is going to be the registration number of the car, because that's something that very rarely changes. So that's a good candidate to have as a natural key, and say, okay, yep, we can't have two of the same with the same license plate number. Okay, yes, there could be, you know, personal plates and vanity plates being swapped around, but unlikely with company cars, and I've checked with the customer for that, and no, they don't use custom plates at the moment, so we're not going to worry about that. We can just say, okay, every license plate number must be unique. And as I say, sometimes it's combinations of keys as well. So each vehicle is going to have a monthly report. So on that particular monthly report table, then what makes it unique is the combination of the license plate and the month of the report. So you can't have two with the same license plate, the same month of the report. So do that, it stops the bad data from getting into your system. Very occasionally it might be very hard to come up with a natural key. So imagine an expenses system. So if I take a taxi from my hotel room to the conference centre, you could say, right, okay, you can only have one taxi per day, or one taxi per day that comes to this particular price. But obviously, if I'm getting a taxi to the hotel room, from the conference to the hotel room, I need to get a taxi back again, and that could very well even have the same price. So sometimes it is legitimately difficult to have a proper natural key, but the vast majority of the time you should be able to get one in there. Data types and lengths. Let's make me a little bit smaller. Okay, another way you can stop bad data getting into your system is to have a think about the data type that you're going to use and the length of the data type. So this fleet management system, which I actually took over from somebody else, when I took that over, the vehicle registration, the license plate, the data type for that was an NVAR-char, and the length was 255 characters. Now, I'm based in New Zealand, and the license plate numbers are only 6 characters long, and they only have alphabetic and numeric characters in them. So there's no need for NVAR-char, so N there is denoting Unicode, which would allow you to include all sorts of, weird and wonderful, strange characters. Your Windings and your Webdings and Taiwanese and Chinese and Japanese and Arabic and all sorts of other stuff. So we don't need those sorts of characters in New Zealand in a license plate number. So it shouldn't be that. And a little note there, numeric data types are for fields on which you will perform mathematical calculations. So a phone number is not a numeric data type, because you don't add phone numbers together. It doesn't make any sense. Similarly with things like invoice numbers. Okay, it depends whether you're the generating system or not. If you're the generating system and you've got to get the next number in the sequence, then that is a mathematical operation that you are performing. Yeah, you're finding the next number. Okay, in which case you'd use a numeric there. But if you're recording the numbers on incoming invoices, so incoming invoice numbers, you're not generating them, again, then you don't need to be using a numeric data type on that, because getting the average of the invoice numbers that you have received is kind of nonsense. So think about your data types and your data lengths. Field and record validation. So let's have a little look at what we've got going on here then. So enforce validation wherever possible. If you've got a start date and an end date, then enforce at the database level that your start date must come before your end date. Yeah, it's just stopping bad data getting into your system. A registration number, for example, should only contain capital letters and numbers. And here in New Zealand, they are either 5 or 6 characters long. So on the right there, I've just got a little bit of SQL code there, which is all I need to make sure that any license plate number that is input into that table contains only alpha and numeric, and it's uppercase, and it is at least 5 digits long. Not very difficult to do, only took a few minutes to put that on, but it may solve all sorts of problems down the line later. So always try and think about your field and your record validation. Okay, delegation. So moving away from data modeling and controlling stuff at your database, which is a general thing that you should always do no matter what platform you're using, onto something which is Power Apps specific. So delegation. Delegation is making the database do the work when you're fetching data from your data source. And that's the way you want to do things, because you want to make sure your data just gives you, you want to make sure your database, your data source is just returning to you the data that you're actually interested in. Anytime you're returning more data than you need, it's a waste. It's a waste on performance and it's a waste on resources. So you want to be pulling back the minimum amount of data every time you make a data call. Now, Power Apps does something kind of cool in that it has this idea of delegation. What it's doing is it's translating your filter and lookup type requests that you type into the formula bar using what we now call the Power FX formula language. So it's translating that into the appropriate language of the data source. Now that's cool because it makes Power Apps data source agnostic. Okay, you don't have to learn a different way of getting data from SQL Server compared to SharePoint compared to Dataverse on the whole. Okay, some of them have some funky complex data types, but on the whole you can just use the same formulas for whichever one, and then Power Apps is going to take care of delegating that, translating that into the native language. So the pro is that you don't have to learn the different database languages. The con is that the translation is not very good. So that's why I've got this little translation up here. So what happens, let's jump onto the next screen to try and show you this. So what happens when we can't translate, or when Power Apps can't translate your formula for fetching data into the native language of the data source? Okay, so what happens is the translator gives up. It says, I don't know how to translate this. And so it says to the data source, look, give me all the information and I'll sort through it and find the ones that we want. So if you're looking through a list of contacts trying to find the person called Jane, and the Power Apps can't delegate that request, what it will do is it will just say to the data source, give me all of the contacts and then I'll find the one that's called Jane, because I can't translate that into your language, so I'm going to do it. Now, when I say all here, there has to be a limit, because your database could potentially be millions of records. You can't have your app pulling down millions of records. So there's an arbitrary limit, okay, that has been set, which is meant to give you sort of a balance between limiting what you can do in terms of the delegation and still giving you reasonable performance. Okay, any data call, the more data you return, the worse the performance. So you can't just pull everything. So here all means up to the delegation limit, which starts at 500. That's the default setting, but you can crank that up to 2000. You shouldn't crank it up to 2000. Okay, you're just going to slow your database down. At least if you use the refresh command anywhere, because there's a bug with the refresh command. Every time you do a refresh on a data source on a specific table, Power Apps will go and pull down all of the records up to the delegation limit, even though you don't want them. Okay, it's been like that for a long time. I believe Microsoft may be looking at changing that behavior. But right now, anytime you do a refresh command and you've got your delegation limit cranked up to 2000 and you've got 2000 records in your database, then your performance is going to be very poor, particularly if you're pulling tables from the likes of Dataverse and the common data model, where things are not properly normalized, and you've got, for example, in the accounts table, there's over 150 columns, and some of them are complex columns which have, additional columns inside them, in effect. So, imagine that you're pulling down data from accounts, which is incredibly wide data, and you're pulling in 2,000 records worth. It's just going to grind your system to a halt. And then people are going to complain, and therefore it's not robust, because you're getting complaints about things not working as they should. Now, what happens if the record that you're looking for is outside your delegation limit? So we were looking for Jane in our list of contacts, and we've got our delegation limit set to 500. What if Jane's record is record number 501, or any number after the first 500? When you do that search to try and find Jane, Jane's not going to be in the result set, because Power Apps is just pulling the first 500 records down and looking for Jane in that list. And if Jane's not there, it's going to say, no, Jane doesn't exist. So non-delegation results in slower and slower performance. It results in incorrect results once you get to the delegation limit, and you also get potential race conditions as well. So remember, Power Apps tries to do a lot of stuff, they say, asynchronously, so it's doing multiple things at the same time. And if it's taking a very long time to do one of those things, to pull some information out, then it could still be processing that while something else is processing, and then you start to get problems because the other thing processing depends on the results of this one, and so boom, you get what's called a race condition, where you normally expect task 1 to finish first, but sometimes task 2 finishes first because non-delegation slows stuff down. Okay, so non-delegation, you must try to avoid non-delegation. Non-delegation means not robust. If you are upping the delegation limit, you're often just delaying the inevitable. Okay, so again, our example with Jane, once she is beyond the delegation limit, you're not going to get that record returned, and people are going to come and say your app is broken because I know Jane is in the system, but I'm not getting her details when I put them in. So simply increasing the delegation limit is not the way to go, because once you've got even more contacts, then again you're going to hit the problem. You're just delaying the inevitable. You're just slowing things down. If you have any non-delegating formulas, because sometimes you can't avoid them, but if you do have any non-delegating formulas, then be absolutely sure you're never going to hit the delegation limit. So there are things like the sum formula is often non-delegable, varies from data source to data source. But let's say that you want to do the sum of the invoice items. Now, if you're absolutely sure that you never have an invoice that has more than 500 items in it, then perhaps you can kind of get away with that. But you've got to be pretty darn sure, because the day that you do have more than that delegation number is the day that your app starts reporting the wrong information or not finding the information that the users are looking for, and that's when your app is failing. It's failing to do what it's supposed to do. So finding non-delegation, how do you do that? Well, watch out for the blue, I think it's double underlining in the formula bar. That will warn you that you've got something which is not delegating. You can also check under the app checker. There's a section for warnings in the app checker. That will also tell you when, or sometimes, we'll come on to that, but that will also give you some indication of whether you have issues with non-delegation and where those are. Keep in mind that some data sources have better delegation support than others. So if you get in the habit of using a particular set of commands, a particular type of filter, and that works fine in one data source, don't assume that that's going to delegate properly in another. So a prime example of this is the use of the search function. The search function will work as expected in SQL Server and Dataverse, but search is not supported by SharePoint, so it doesn't delegate. So if you're doing a search in SharePoint, not delegable. Now, just keep in mind as well, I've said, how to look out for non-delegation, but not all non-delegating sources actually get reported with these blue underlines or in the app checker. So if you're doing things like first filter or first n or last n and filter, again, depends a bit on the data sources, but that may not be delegated. Account or count rows is generally not delegated, but is not necessarily reported. I think count rows is, but not count. Count is not reported as non-delegating. So the way to really find out what's going on is to use the performance monitor. So I've done some videos on performance if you want to check that out. But performance monitor, it lives under the advanced tools in the navigator in the left-hand side of the studio. You really want to turn performance monitor on while you're developing your apps, and then keep an eye on it so you can see what's going on under the hood. You can actually see how many records are being returned and how often the different formulas are firing. And you always want to try to limit the number of records being returned to just what you need, and equally you only want to be going and fetching data from the database when you need it. Otherwise it affects performance and so on. System restrictions. Okay. So as well as having some limits like the delegation limit, there are also things like API limits. So an example of that is how many times in 60 seconds you can make a request of your data source. If you go over the API limit, then the data source will just ignore your request, or your request won't get passed on to the data source. So a good way you can sort of simulate this is if you create a gallery and you hook that up to some data source that say has 100 or so records in it, and then in that gallery you put a couple of say text boxes or labels which have a formula under them, which is a lookup field. Okay, and the lookup is then going to have to go to the database and find the information. What you will find is the way the gallery works is as the gallery populates with those 100 or so records, then each one of those is going to fire the lookup. So that's a way that you can quickly fire lots and lots of lookups, lots and lots of data requests to see the impact of this API limit. So you need to make your apps as efficient as possible, otherwise you're in danger of hitting API limits. And also keep in mind that SharePoint lists, even if you are doing a delegable request, once you hit, I think it's 5,000 items in the SharePoint list, then the SharePoint list may just say, I'm not playing anymore, I'm not going to give you any data. I think there are some ways around it. I'm not a SharePoint expert, but you know, that's a fair bit of work and a fair bit of messing around, and it's the sort of thing that catches people out. So you're working away, you're testing, everything seems fine, you get your app out to your users, and you know, everyone's giving you the thumbs up, and then you hit the 5,000 item limit in a table or a list in SharePoint, and suddenly the app stops working for everyone. So you know, it's this awkwardness of how does the app behave under load and with large amounts of data compared to how it behaves when you're building the app and you're just testing it against a very small amount of data. Ensure the app checker is clear of errors. So there's a thing called the app checker in Studio. So it's that little sort of stethoscope up in the right hand corner. And if there's an error in your app, you will get a little red dot. Now, errors are distinct to warnings. You can have lots of warnings in there and not get any red dot. But if you've got errors, you know, proper formula errors or runtime errors, things that fail when the app is running, then you're going to get a red dot on there. So you shouldn't publish an app which has got errors in it. Okay, you know that's not robust. You know it's broken already. So don't go and publish an app which has errors. Power Apps Studio will let you do it, but you know, you absolutely shouldn't. There are a few exceptions. So one of them, for example, is if your app uses save data or load data commands, then you will get a runtime error with a little red dot against the app checker in your app, and you can't clear it. The reason for that is that save data and load data commands are not supported in a web browser. They're only supported on the Android and iOS mobile players. I'm not sure whether they're supported on the Windows one, because the Windows one is effectively deprecated, and for a long time the offline functions like that didn't work. They may have finally sorted them out, but I may be coming on to this later. You shouldn't use the Windows player, because it's lots of versions behind and it's known to have lots of bugs and lots of problems, so that's not robust at all. So anyway, you can only do Power Apps Studio in a web browser. A web browser does not support save data and load data, so you will always have a little red mark on your app checker if you're using save data and load data. But what you can do is just expand the app checker out so that you can see what errors are being displayed. Okay, yeah, I know that load data, save data are a problem. I'll ignore those and I'll look for anything else. So avoid errors. Security. So ensure any associated connections and flows to your Power App belong to a service account. Otherwise, when the owner of those flows particularly leaves the company, they're all going to fail. Okay, even if you've shared them and made somebody else a co-owner, if they run under the context of the owner, then they're going to fail. Particularly affects things like scheduled flows, because those always run under the context of the owner because they're not being called by a Power App. But you know, just be wary of that. So one of your reactions might be to say, oh, I better have plenty of co-owners for my Power Apps then. Well, the only problem there is that your co-owners may have a tendency to go and dabble in your app, which is not very good if they change things that you don't know about. So, try to enforce some discipline about who's going to go into the app and make changes, and definitely have some discipline regarding who publishes new versions of the app and when they publish them. The other thing to watch out for is if your business rules are enforced in the app rather than in the database. So really, I'm talking about those data rules. If you've had to enforce some of those at the app level rather than the data source level, database level, then make sure your users can't just bypass the app, okay, and go straight to the data source and start messing around with the data. That's particularly a problem with SharePoint lists, because if you give somebody read-write access to a SharePoint list, it's very hard to restrict them from accessing that list via SharePoint. So, yeah, just something to be aware of. Experimental and preview features. Okay, so should you use them? Well, let's read the fine print. Experimental features. These features may change, break, or disappear at any time. That does not lead to a robust app, so do not switch on experimental features. Preview features. These features will be turned on for all apps soon. Please test your apps with these features enabled and report any problems. Okay, so why does it say that? Excuse me. Yes, I was saying, preview features. These features will be turned on for all apps soon. Please test your apps with these features enabled and report any problems. Well, I'm not going to test these features in a production app. So never turn on preview features for a production app. You may want to turn on the preview features for a copy of it that you are testing. I'm afraid I don't really have time to do Microsoft's testing for them, so I generally just leave the preview features turned off. So an app which uses preview or experimental features by definition is not robust. Now, occasionally, again, there's always caveats to these rules I'm giving you. Occasionally, you may have no choice but to turn one of these on because of other bugs or limitations in Power Apps. So recently I had a Power App that was regularly crashing when run in a web browser. And it turned out that was, a platform issue, a bug with the Power Apps platform itself, whereby in the web browser, if you had screens that used drop-downs in a particular way and you navigated away from that screen and then back to it again, it would just crash the app. Okay, that was just the behaviour that it did, but there's a relatively new feature, I can't remember whether it's an experimental or preview at the moment, but it's keep recently loaded screens in memory, and that solved the problem. Okay, since we've turned that on, we haven't had that issue anymore. And so I've had to speak to the users of that app, the customers for that app, and say to them, okay, we've got a choice. We can either leave it as it is, where we know that it will crash, every now and again, or we can switch on this feature and it will stop crashing, but there's a potential that something else might go wrong in the future. Okay, and the client for that one has said, okay, we'll take that risk for the benefit of not having to put up with all this crashing anymore. We will accept that there's a potential risk in the future, but you've got to weigh these things up. Okay. And another thing to just be a little bit concerned about is there's no control over when these features become generally available. So as you can see under the preview features, it says these will be turned on soon for all apps. You've got no control over that being turned on or not. Hopefully that is not going to affect existing apps, so apps that are already published and are running. Okay, but sometimes it does. I've had this on a number of occasions now where I have not touched the app for months and it's all working fine, and then I come in one day, usually on a Monday because the updates usually happen at the weekend, and a whole bunch of apps are broken and a whole bunch of people are complaining because the changes have been implemented. Now, it doesn't happen too often well, once is too often, so I'm saying it doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened to me. So I can promise you that it happens. But Microsoft, do their best to try to prevent, an existing app which hasn't been republished changing its behavior. But here's the other thing: if you go and you make a change to an app and then you publish it again, then you are definitely going to pick up all those new features that have been marked as GA or have gone into general availability. You've got no control over that. Power Apps is always going to run on the latest version of Power Apps. So when you republish it to the latest version and you pick up all those things. So this does tend to mean that any time you republish an app for any reason, even if you're just fixing a typo in a label, then you really should fully test your app. So you can see in the details of the app, the version history, you can see the version that the app used to be on, and then if you republish it, you can see the version that you're on now. And if that version has changed, then the behavior of your app may very well have changed as well. So if your app is doing anything kind of important, then good idea to test it first. And at this point, you're probably sort of picking up certain vibes from me. At this point, I would say, do not put anything business critical on Canvas Power Apps. Okay, don't do it. It's not worth the risk. It simply isn't. So there we go. Next thing, avoid duplication. This is perhaps something that would be better put in the maintainability, making your apps more maintainable, but I think it also applies here. In Power Apps, there is very limited scope for function reuse. Okay, so if you've written something that saves a contact into the contacts database and it performs a whole bunch of validation, great, and then you need to have that same feature on another screen in your app, then you have to duplicate all that code. And then if you make a change to one, you've got to remember to make a change to the other, and that often doesn't happen. And so you find that you've got slightly different code in different places in your app, and then that is a good route for errors to get into the system. So it's a good idea to avoid having multiple screens that effectively perform the same task. Sometimes you have to get a bit creative. So if there are lots of places where you are saving a contact, maybe what you want to do is you want to force somebody into a separate screen, which is just for saving contacts, and then you return back to the screen that you were on before, whatever task it was, where you wanted to save a contact in the middle of that process. So rather than repeating the code, try to make sure that you always, have one place where you perform that task, and try and structure your app so it moves the user to that place. You may be sacrificing some UI, UX, so user interface, user experience, polish, but at the end of the day, the app actually working is more important than the app being pretty. Sorry, all you UX, UI people out there. So screens within the app. Avoid doing things like having a separate screen for add record, new record, view record. So a recent app I've been working on, there were 5 screens for performing effectively the same task. Dealing with the data from a particular table. Each of those screens looked exactly the same. In fact, the developer of that had tried to make it so that the end user wouldn't be aware that they were being taken to different screens. And the functionality of those screens was only very, very slightly different between them. But each of those screens had like 700 controls on it. So keeping all of that stuff in sync is just impossible. So avoid the duplication. It's hard to do with Power Apps. Okay, I've said before, you can write bad code in any language. In Power Apps, PowerFX it's called now, the language. In PowerFX it is hard to write good code because you don't have the same code reuse that you can get with other languages. There is some work being done on that, but again, it's also preview or experimental, so I'm not going to put it in a published production app. Avoid hacks, stick to common practices or common patterns. So there are some really clever hacks that people have found in Power Apps. So an example of one, I think this one, I don't know if Todd Baginski came up with it, but certainly his was the first explanation of it that I came across. And that's to put a toggle button on a screen, set the default of the toggle button to a global variable, and then have some code on the onChange event of that toggle button. And then if you change the value of the global variable, you can trigger that code, and that way you're getting some code reuse in Power Apps, which, as I've just said, is a huge problem in Power Apps. Okay, the problem with that is that it is clearly not the way that Microsoft intended you to use the product. Here's another example. If you want to fire an HTTP request and you don't want to be paying the premium license fee of $10 US per app per user per month, then you can put the HTTP request into the image property of an image control. Okay, and that will fire off the HTTP request. And then if you're clever, you can have the service that receives the HTTP request send back an icon of a thumbs up or a thumbs down, so you know whether the thing worked or not. Will Page was the one who brought that to my attention, so kudos to him. But while these are undoubtedly very clever, they are unsupported scenarios, and so Microsoft might change that behavior at any time. Okay, so if Microsoft decide that too many people are getting around licensing by using that HTTP request, they will find some way of turning it off. If they find that toggle buttons being changed from other screens is giving them rendering issues or performance issues or something like that, they might change it so it doesn't work anymore. So you really want to stick to common patterns. Otherwise, the platform may change on you and these hacks that you were relying on may no longer work for you. So don't put these hacks into your production apps. The other thing is be wary of less popular features. So the other thing that may happen is if Microsoft put a feature into Power Apps and only a few people use it, they may pull it out again. So an example of that is rules. So early on in Power Apps, rules were being pushed as being a cool way that you could build the logic into your apps, but it didn't take off. I never really used them. And Microsoft have decided to pull them out. So if you were relying on those, sorry, but you've got to rewrite your apps. There were certain things you could only do with that. So if you want to change the Z order, the order in which things overlap each other, the only way I'm aware of doing that was through the rules. You can't do that with normal formulas. So if you had an app that, relied on the Z order changing, you're stuck. Now, Microsoft don't pull things out of the product very often, but, if you're one of the people who is using that feature that does get pulled out, you're not going to be happy. So how do you know what are going to be the less popular features? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but, you can probably get a feel from it from the Power Apps community and from reading, web pages and seeing what features people are using and what features they're not. Expect the unexpected. So try to anticipate marginal scenarios, so things that don't happen very often, but try to anticipate them and figure out how you're going to handle them. So you need to have less a sort of a when-if attitude as a when it happens attitude. Okay, if it can happen, it's probably going to happen. So an example of this is the fleet admin system that I've been working on refactoring. That, as I said, you can have a monthly return. So each month, each vehicle should have one report submitted, and that's usually by the person who drives the car, in that month. But what happens if the car is transferred between two people mid-month? Who's supposed to put the report in? Are they both supposed to put a report in? What are you supposed to do in that scenario? Now, you will learn to sort of pick out these scenarios and identify these scenarios as you get better with data modeling. Because as you get better with data modeling, you start to ask these questions as you're actually building the tables and building the relationships between them. because all the time you're thinking about what are the rules that govern this information and how it interrelates with each other. And it's okay sometimes to handle those marginal scenarios outside the app. So when I went back to the client and said, hey, does this ever happen? And they said, well, not often, but it does. And I said, well, what do you want to do about it? And they said, well, look, it's so infrequent that we would rather just handle it outside of the app. We don't want you to do anything in the app. Leave the rules as they are in the app. We don't need to change that. We'll handle it, outside. We've got some other process for dealing with that. The only thing I would say there is make sure that is thoroughly understood by all parties and documented. Otherwise, when the owners of the app change, because not just the developers leave and move on and go and do something else, but the people who originally specified the app and use the app may change and hand over to somebody else. And the people they hand over to may consider that to be a defect, a bug in your app. It isn't, it was agreed, but it's good to have the documentation and say, hey, look, the app is working to spec. This is not a bug. Okay, it's a bit of semantics, but, just my advice, cover yourself. Testing. So if you want to know if your app is robust or not, you need to test. You need to test under a representative data load, okay, because we've seen that if you go over delegation limits, if you go over certain limits in SharePoint, then your app is just not going to function correctly. So you need to have an eye on the performance issues and the delegation issues, and you can only do that by making sure you're testing against a representative data load. Test on the target hardware. Okay, if you've got some awesome development machine with 32 gig of RAM and the latest processor and fancy GPUs all going, you're going to get very different performance from someone who is using a 5-year-old iPhone or someone who's using a bottom of the market Android device. So you really need to test on the target hardware to know how it is going to perform and how it is going to behave. And as I've mentioned before, the Windows app player is missing features. Apparently there's another one in the works, I believe, not sure. But the existing one, if you can even download it from the App Store anymore, is so far out of date that you don't really want to use it. And we've had issues before where people have come and said, hey, look, we've got these Windows devices and we really want to be able to do offline scenarios with them, and we have to just say, can't do it, not supported, sorry. So test on the target hardware. And get different people to test as well, because different people will interact with your app in different ways. So an app I was working on recently, I tested it thoroughly. I'd gone through it lots of times, but then we put it in the hands of someone else, and they found that if they mashed one of the buttons in the app, if they went tap, 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 then weird things happened in the app. Effectively, once you've hit this particular save or add button in the app and it's added to the row of data, the button should become disabled, so you can't put it in again. But again, it was sort of to do with race conditions and the fact that the app was still double checking whether the data had actually gone into the database or not. That meant that it was still enabled when it shouldn't have been. And the way you found that out was the sort of person who goes around smashing buttons all the time. I'm not a person who does that, so I wouldn't notice that as a problem. So get different people to test your apps as well. And accept that some things are beyond your control. So for example here, different web browsers, and even different versions of the same web browser, will render things differently. Okay, so if you've got particularly picky users who really like the look of the app, who are really fussed about how that app looks, and they're moving things or getting you to move things sort of down to the pixel and saying, right, I want a gap exactly this big between these two items, well then the next time a new version of Edge or Chrome comes out, that may not be the same anymore, because that's just not how web browsers and web code works. It's all sort of interpreted type of stuff. So, you've got to accept that's beyond your control, and you've got to set the expectations of your users as well. And try not to let those things get raised as defects. Otherwise, you're forever going to be changing your app and then changing it back again and then changing it again, as different people use different web browsers and they make different complaints, and then the web browsers get updated again and you have to change it again. So accept some stuff is beyond your control. Okay, so those are my thoughts on trying to make your apps more robust. So make note that I don't say this is how you can make your Power Apps robust, because robust or not robust is not a on-off type situation. It is a spectrum from not very robust going up to very robust. Nothing is completely robust. So you've kind of got a spectrum going on. So we're just trying to sort of push ourselves further up that spectrum towards the more robust end. Would I recommend putting critical business systems on Canvas Power Apps? I can't comment on model apps or Power Apps portals. I don't work in that space. Okay, so I don't feel qualified to comment there. But I do feel qualified to comment in the Canvas app space, and my recommendation would be do not put anything business critical on Power Apps. That is not what it is meant for. And on that scale of robustness, you are never going to get to the level of robustness that you would want to achieve if your application is business critical, because there are too many factors that are outside of your control. The nature of Power Apps, with this fast iteration cycle, with new versions of Power Apps dropping weekly, and with things like experimental and preview features, and people being expected to sort of do the testing and give the feedback. With that kind of scenario, it's just not going to be robust. It's a two-edged coin. On the one side, you've got, we're getting new features all the time and we're getting performance improvements all the time. The flip side of it is we're getting a bit different behaviors all the time. We're getting new bugs all the time. Okay, so take it or leave it. My advice, do not put anything business critical on a Power App. But there is a lot we can do to make our apps more robust than perhaps they might be. Okay, thanks very much for sitting through all of that. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. I'll be doing a video soon on how we can make our apps more maintainable, so how we can make it easier for ourselves and for others to go into our app and debug it and find problems and make changes and so on. So hopefully I'll get that out soon. I'm also thinking about doing something on the concept of citizen development. So in the wake of the Ignite conference, where citizen development was being very, very hyped, I'm afraid I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon on that topic, and I think there is a lot too much hype on that topic and a lot more danger than people appreciate. So yes, I would like to try and get that video out soon as well. So if you're interested in either of those, then let me know in the comments. That might spur me on to get them recorded a bit more quickly. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and happy power apping. Don't forget to subscribe and like and comment and all that other stuff they say on YouTube, and I'll see you in the next video.